Please join me in reading the Psalm 91, which is found on page 810 of your hymnal. Those who dwell in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord,
My refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust.
For the Lord will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence, and will cover you with his pinions.
Under the Lord's wings you will find refuge. God's faithfulness is a shield and helper.
You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day,
Nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday.
1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you.
You will only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked.
Because you have made the Lord your refuge, the Most High your habitation.
No evil shall befall you, no scourge come near your tent.
For God will give his angels charge over you, to guard you in all your ways.
They will bear you up on their hands, lest you dash your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot.
Because they cleave to me in love, I will deliver them.
I will protect them because they know my name.
When they call to me, I will answer them. I will be with them in trouble. I will rescue them and honor them.
I will satisfy them with long life and show them my salvation.
You may be seated. Our reading today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Thanks be to God.
This morning is the final sermon in the series Earn, Save, and Give, where we've been exploring John Wesley's rules for the use of money. We touched on how the precious gift of money can make us wise as we explore how to use that well and to use that gift for God's purposes. We spoke of the diligence that John Wesley encouraged among the early Methodists in their lives, and of his frugality and the way that he was careful with those precious resources. And this morning's invitation is to consider his final rule, which is to give all that you can. And at the conclusion of our worship service, there'll be a moment of consecration. And if you received your pledge card, your commitment card in the mail and would like to bring it forward as an act of worship, a plate will be placed on a table in the front there that you may do so. Everything I needed to know about Christian stewardship, I learned from National Public Radio. It could have saved me an awful lot of seminary debt, but that's another sermon for another day. And in this show, Terry Gross, who's the host of that radio program, was interviewing a pastor who was retiring. His name was Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood, and he had been the pastor at St. Paul's Community Church in Brooklyn, and in one of the poorest and one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in that city. When Youngblood went to that church, there was a turning around of that body, a dying institution that had been crumbling became a vibrant place of religious and spiritual activity. It became a center for community renewal and new life. The church created its own school, and through very innovative programs, they were very successful in engaging young black men to come back into the life of faith. They built housing. They replaced brothels with apartments. Well, during the interview, Youngblood went on and spoke with great enthusiasm for his work. He talked about 12-step groups that they had started for those who were addicted to all sorts of things. Their congregation did job training fairs so people that were not employed could learn to work. He spoke about teaching young men and young women how to respect their own bodies and the precious gift of sexuality, and how that made such a large difference in the lives of many. Well, toward the end of the interview, Youngblood mentioned stewardship, and Terry Gross got almost irate. She said, "No, you don't ask them for money, do you? How can you ask the poorest people in one of the poorest parts of our country for money?" And then Youngblood responded, "I most certainly do." He went on to say that the problem in Brooklyn was not a lack of money. It was what the people were doing with their money that was killing them. He offered to take Terry Gross back to Brooklyn, telling her that he could show her many a liquor store that does a brisk business each and every day. He reminded her that one can gamble on just about any street corner anytime you want to in that neighborhood. He said that prostitution was rampant and that the drug dealers all had pockets filled with cash. The problem was not a lack of money in Brooklyn. The problem was how money was being used. Youngblood went on to say that the task of Christian stewardship is to funnel the precious resources of our communities away from those things that destroy and that harm, and to move those resources toward those things that build life and create the kinds of communities that we want for ourselves and that we want for the people we care about. The story of Zacchaeus is a story about the wealth of a community being refocused. And the story of Zacchaeus happens because God gives all that God can. And that precious gift makes a critical difference. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. That most likely meant that he was both Jewish and that he worked for the Roman Empire. The Roman system of taxation was this. They would hire one of the residents of the communities that they were occupying and ask that person to collect the taxes that were due the empire through that community. Now, this tax collector would receive no salary from the empire, but would be entitled to keep whatever he could raise over and above the amount that was due to the empire. The potential for abuse was great. And the story suggests that this Zacchaeus took full advantage of those opportunities for abuse. Luke says in quite clear fashion, he was a tax collector and he was rich. Not only was he rich, but he became wealthy by betraying his own community and doing so with the full weight and the authority of the empire behind him. The implication of the story is that Zacchaeus has cheated everybody in town and that he has been cheating them for a long time. And that's why everybody grumbles. They probably did a little more than grumble. When Jesus said, "I'm going to have dinner with you." And when Jesus goes into Zacchaeus' home, something happens. Now, I really wish Luke had been a little more forthcoming with the details of that dinner party. I would have loved to have heard what it was Zacchaeus had to say in his own defense. I wonder, would he offer the same kinds of excuses that I tend to offer? And I wonder what crisp, fresh, theological response would have flown from the nimble mind of Jesus in response to those excuses. I guess we'll never know how that dialogue unfolded. Or maybe there was no dialogue at all. Maybe Jesus just looked at Zacchaeus long enough, honestly enough, clearly enough for Zacchaeus to feel loved, to feel valued, to feel as if he did not have to live by what he could take, to find another way. However, the story does bear witness to a very fruitful conversion. Zacchaeus turns his life around. He gave half of everything he had to the poor. And he promised to repay everybody, not just the debt he owed them, but to do it 4 times over. And Jesus is delighted. Zacchaeus, today, salvation has come to your home. Now, we could conclude from the text that salvation is not limited to a cosmic elevator ride out of this broken world up into a place of glory and bliss. We can conclude from this text that salvation is more about a restoration of a community. It is about a people coming together, learning to forgive, learning to trust. It's about Zacchaeus learning to share. We can rightly conclude from this text that salvation is about the ending of the profound injustices that plague us. Salvation is a community learning to be a community again. Salvation is the party that we have when the hurting stops and life becomes as God intended. Zacchaeus gave all he could because Jesus came to him. John Wesley gave all that he could. The more I learn about John Wesley, the more I admire him and find such great things in his life. I came across this little snippet from his life I'd like to share with you. In the year 1731, Wesley began to limit his expenses so that he would have more money to share with the poor. He records that one year his income was 30 pounds and his annual expenses were 28 pounds. Thus, he was able to give 2 pounds for those in need. The next year, his income doubled. But he still managed to live on 28 pounds. So he had 32 pounds to give to the poor. In the third year, his income jumped to 90 pounds. And instead of letting his expenses rise with his income, he kept them at 28 pounds, and he gave 62 pounds for the poor. In the fourth year, he received 120 pounds, and as before, his expenses were still 28 pounds. So his giving rose to 92 pounds. That is admirable. That's our heritage. That's where we have come from. He's also reported to have said, "If I die with more than 10 pounds in my pocket, you can call me a thief." John Wesley gave all that he could. Now, no sermon about giving all that we can would ever be complete if we didn't skip ahead a couple of chapters in the Gospel of Luke and see through Jesus' eyes what he saw one day in the temple. Jesus was watching. It might have been a stewardship campaign. All the people were throwing their gifts into the box. Well, there was no paper money in those days, so all would hear the sounds of the coins that were given. I wonder if the crowd cheered when people came with great big buckets and held them up as high as they could and dumped them down for maximum effect. Maybe their preacher told them to do that, I don't know. And while others were oohing and eyeing over all the loudness of the gifts, Jesus saw something else. Jesus heard something that could not be drowned out of his ears by all the noise. I wonder how he knew she was a widow. I wonder how he knew she was poor. I wonder, how did he know that the 2 coins that she put in the treasury that day were the very last that she had? We always speak of the widow's mite, but a mite is an English coin. It probably was a lepka, the very smallest of Greek coins. And when you toss it on a pile of other money or into a box, it probably would make no sound at all. But it was a sound that Jesus heard. And I wonder if Jesus didn't see something else as he looked on the generosity of that woman. Does she tell Jesus the meaning of his own life? Because just as she gave everything she had, 2 small coins tossed into the temple box, Jesus will give everything he has as he tosses out his very last breath for the sake of the world and for the sake of me and for you. Did she announce for him clearly the full meaning of his life? She gave all that she could, and so did Jesus. You know, whenever I think of the story, my mind goes back to West Canaan, New Hampshire. I don't know if you've ever traveled Route 4 from Lebanon and headed east and gone through Enfield and on toward Canaan. But when you get about halfway between Enfield and Canaan, you'll find the Wayside Chapel. I think it's the smallest building in Methodism. And I had the pleasure of being their pastor. It was 8:15 in West Canaan, 9:15 in Enfield, and 10:30 back in Canaan. And Lita, well, she went to church in West Canaan. There were about 6 or 7 of us faithfully every Sunday morning. And her husband, Louis, used to bring her to church. Lita never learned how to drive. And after her husband died, she asked me if I'd be willing to pick her up Sunday mornings on the way to church. And I said that I'd be happy to do so, and so I did. And we had wonderful chats in the few minutes we drove from her home to the church. Picked her up most Sundays except one Sunday I didn't. I got to the door and I knocked, and she came and she said, "I'm not going to church today, preacher. I'm sick." And then she started coughing, and she coughed, and she was really sick. Now she lived in an old New Hampshire farmhouse that her husband had built. Her home had no central heat in it. She just had this cook stove in the kitchen, and she was feeding wood into that stove, huddled up in her sweater and her housecoat. She was sick as a dog. I wanted to say to her, "Please come to church, you'll be warmer." But that would have offended her. And then she reached into her pocket and she pulled out this wad of well-used Kleenex. She coughed a little more, she sneezed a bit, she wiped her nose and put it back in her pocket. And we chatted a little more. We said a word of prayer together around that cook stove. And as I was leaving, she said, "Wait!" And then she reached into that same pocket and she pulled out her church offering envelope and she handed it to me. And she said, "Take this and put it in the plate. I can't have my church getting behind." Well, I was a little worried about touching that envelope. I knew what pocket she'd had it in. I was afraid I might get infected by all those germs. Well, I took it. I put it in the plate. I got infected, but I wasn't sick. She was grieving. She was cold. She was sick. But she still loved God, loved the church. She gave all she could. She gave all she could. And so will I. Amen.